Hi, Neil and LeBron, bringing you more fun with philosophy. We're going to look at the article by B.C. Johnson called God and the Problem of Evil. Hopefully, as I've said on other videos, you can have that in front of you. I will be reading from it, so hopefully you can refer to it. Um, One of the first things I want to note here about this article is that it uses an argument form that's kind of unusual. It's called an ad absurdum argument. You should have a sheet of paper there that essentially uh, shows you what presents to you various points, and on the reverse at the bottom of that, it talks about an ad absurdum argument, and and the author of the article, B.C. Johnson, uses this kind of argument throughout the article. And what this form of argument does is it essentially takes a principle that is implied in some argument, and it shows how if you take this principle and you take it to its conclusion, it ends up with an absurd result that no one would believe. In other words, it takes what seems to be not unreasonable and then pushes it to the extreme. And then you see that it's unreasonable, and so you end up, if you end up with something extreme with your principle, the principle must be false. We see the kind of thing that an ad absurdum argument does when if your father or your mother catches you smoking, and when they've told you not to smoke, maybe you're too young to smoke or something like that, they catch you smoking and they say, oh, okay, you want to smoke, and they force you to smoke a whole pack of cigarettes, and of course you get sick from it. And the idea being that why would you engage in something that, when you do it like this, is going to make you sick? Certainly one cigarette will also in some sense make you sick. It's to get you to a point of you see the absurdity of smoking. So this ad absurdum argument form is used throughout the article. So that's one thing that you should know going into the article. One of the other things that about the article is that B.C. Johnson arranges it so that it's kind of like he's having a conversation with himself. I mean, he's having a dialogue with himself. It's a fast dialogue. He doesn't say, here's me one and here's me two. But what he's doing is he's taking the position of the atheist or the anti-theist, the person who doesn't believe in God and thinks that belief in God is not particularly warranted by the facts. So he takes and he himself is arguing for an atheist position, but he challenges his position with what he imagines a theist would respond to his arguments, and actually the position that B.C. Johnson takes from the theist point of view is a traditional position. I mean, these are all arguments that are used quite regularly throughout the history of talking about this particular kind of argument for against belief in God. So B.C. Johnson sets it up: atheist, theist, atheist, theist, and so what happens is that there's a structure in this article where one argument leads to another. And so you should know that a lot of what you're reading is what B.C. Johnson is presenting as the challenge to his position, and then he responds to that. So there is that. One of the other important underlying points in this article is, and it's very important, it's the main category, one of the major categories of this kind of argument, is that Johnson is in the arguing in the tradition of what's called rational theology. In other words, the idea that belief in God should make sense. I mean, even if we can't say for certain that the evidence leads this way or that way, that belief should make sense. It should be rational. It shouldn't be irrational. It shouldn't be against our entire understanding. So that even if we say that even if we have quote unquote faith in God, that faith should make sense. And so what Johnson is trying to present here is rational arguments for and against belief in God. And I should also say that there is a tradition in philosophy and theology of anti-rational belief in God, that the claim that belief in God doesn't necessarily have to make sense, doesn't necessarily have to be rational. In fact, maybe one of the main recommendations of belief in God is that it's irrational. It challenges our rationality. If you're interested in that point of view, you're not going to get it here. But if you want to pursue someone in that vein, you should look up someone who, a Dutch philosopher, Soren Kierkegaard. There's most of his works are in translation. He's very difficult and very hard to understand, but he is in that tradition of what we might call anti-rationalism, non-rational beliefs in God. So we're in this tradition of rational theology, and as such, Johnson starts his article out in this way. The first sentence of his article: here is a common situation. A house catches on fire and a 6-month-old baby is painfully burned to death. Could we possibly describe as good any person who had the power to save this child and yet refused to do so? So there's two questions we might ask about this. Why does Johnson use as an example this horrifying example of babies burning to death? I mean, can we think of a more offensive, repulsive event and offensive, repulsive example? So why does he choose that particular example, such a repugnant one? And the fast answer here is that Johnson chooses something bad happening to an infant because the infant, we assume, is innocent. If we chose an adult, most adults are guilty of something, and probably most adults are guilty of lots of things. So you could say, well, this bad thing happened to this adult because he or she was guilty of something and God was punishing him or her. With an innocent baby, we can't make the argument that this bad thing happens to this innocent baby because it's a punishment. It's an innocent baby. I mean, you can get into original sin, I suppose, but we might be entering areas of non-rationality when we get there, or irrationality, if we want our belief in God to make sense, to be rational. So in the one way, Johnson chooses a 6-month-old baby burned to death because the baby's innocent. So it can't be in the category of, well, God's punishing this baby. The other part of that sentence that kind of slips by maybe is that Johnson says a house catches on fire and a 6-month-old baby is painfully burned to death. In other words, it's not just a fast bam, the baby is dead. It's a painful process, and one of the pieces there that Johnson is going to emphasize is that it's not only an innocent being, but this innocent being suffers. And one of the problems in what the problem of evil is called is trying to explain suffering. It's not just death, it's a painful, suffering death. Why do, so we could expand the question, why do human beings suffer? And the point here is, it's not just a little suffering. It's it's bad suffering. It's suffering for a long time and sharply. So the selection of this example is not accidental. It's an innocent being who um, suffers very badly. So that's why Johnson starts with this example. Um, so that's Johnson's presentation. That's Johnson's challenge. Now, this argument that Johnson is talking about, I mean, the name of the article is God and the Problem of Evil. And the problem of evil is a particular challenge to rational theology, to a rational belief in God, one that makes sense. And it goes like this. And I had this on one of the sides of the sheet that you have. And that is in bold, a couple paragraphs down, I have the problem of evil can be simply stated. If God is all powerful and supremely good, how can there be evil in the world? If God is all powerful and supremely good, how can there be evil in the world? So you look at it like this. If God is all powerful, he or she or it has the power to defeat evil. I mean, God is all powerful. There is nothing that can defeat God. So if God is all powerful, God should be able to defeat any evil in the world. And the other part of that is if God is supremely good, if God is the perfection of goodness, without any touch of evil or badness, if God is supremely good, God should want to defeat evil. So there are these two characteristics. God has the power to defeat evil, and God has a will to defeat evil. I mean, to the nth degree, all power and all good. So given those two characteristics of God, why then the problem of evil goes? Why is there evil in the world? Now, let me back up for a minute. Why does Johnson choose these two characteristics? I mean, where does he get, supremely all-powerful and supremely good? Where does he get those two characteristics? Those two characteristics are some of the many characteristics that God has traditionally been thought to possess. And by traditionally, I mean a tradition going back to the Old Testament and the New Testament and several thousands of years of conversation among theologians and philosophers as to what characteristics does this supreme being that many people worship and think is among other characteristics, the creator of the universe, that the creator of the universe has. And so it has been thought in these thousands of years that God has at least these two characteristics, all powerful, supremely powerful, and supremely good. So when B.C. Johnson uses these two characteristics, Johnson is not just pulling them out of thin air, as it were. They're traditional characteristics of God. And what the problem of evil shows, I mean, what it's set up to show, is that if evil exists, then these two characteristics of God, supreme power and supreme goodness, contradict each other. I mean, contradict each other and evil. So the question, again, is how can a being who is all-powerful and supremely good allow for evil in the world? This being, God, should have the power to defeat evil, being all-powerful, and since supremely good, God should be willing to defeat evil. So why is there evil in the world? So the article starts like that. And one of the first answers that people give to this very specific question of a baby, a 6-month-old baby burns to death painfully in a house, one of the responses to that, and this is a common response, is that the angel goes, the baby goes to heaven. and presumably becomes an angel. We sort of hear this in deaths, particularly of younger people. I think that God, why did this young person die? Why did they have to die? Well, the answer is God wanted an angel, which is to say that this person, now deceased, went to heaven, and so the implication is it must be good. God, this baby went to heaven, became an angel, and so it must be good. Um, as as uh, uh, um, as Johnson points out, that doesn't really tell us very much at all. It says that we assume that it's good, uh, this act happening, that it's not bad, but it doesn't really explain to us why it happens. Why did this baby have to suffer? So, um, as Johnson says in the third paragraph in the article, he says it is not enough to say that the baby's painful death would, in the long run, have good results and therefore should have happened. Otherwise, God would not have permitted it. In other words, the explanation here is that this baby dying, it wasn't really bad. It looked bad, but it wasn't really bad because it went to heaven and it's with God. So that's good to be with God. But what Johnson says here that is that these good results don't justify it. In fact, to say that the baby went to heaven is assuming something good when what we want to prove is God's goodness. In other words, God is all powerful and supremely good. Well, we're assuming that God is good, but that's one of the characteristics that is in question in this problem of evil. In other words, um, you know, if God is all powerful and supremely good, why does evil happen? Well, it must be good. But the evil challenges God's goodness, doesn't it? I mean, evil existing, if God is all powerful, evil in the world challenges God's goodness. So the response by the theist is to say, well, it's just good. The baby goes to heaven, it must be good because the baby is with God. Um, uh, uh, Johnson says that, and I think it's probably true, that's not a very adequate argument to say that the baby dies and it must be good. Therefore, God is good. Therefore, it must be good. We need to show that God is good as one of his her or its essential qualities. So one of the things that happens here is that is that what we seem to argue is that there's a certain results orientedness in this, that as Johnson says in the third paragraph, he says, let me read that whole paragraph up to this point. He says, it is not enough to say that the baby's painful death would in the long run have good results and therefore should have happened. Otherwise, God would not have permitted it. For if we know this to be true, then we know, just as God knows, that every action successfully performed must in the end be good and therefore the right thing to do. Otherwise, God would not have allowed it to happen. And what Johnson is saying here is that if God is all powerful and therefore and supremely good, and therefore what looks like evil or bad happening in the world is not really evil because the suffering baby goes to be with God. If everything that's bad is really good because a good God would not have allowed it to be bad, then what Johnson says essentially, if it wasn't good, I mean the argument is if it wasn't good, God would not have allowed it because God is supremely powerful and supremely good. If it wasn't good, God would not have allowed it. And then the next move is to say, since it happened, something happened, It looks to be bad, but it happened. God allowed it, therefore it must be good. So even though it looks bad, if God allows it, it must really be good. In other words, if it wasn't good, because God is good, if this event happened, if it wasn't good, God would not have allowed it. So if it happens, it must not be bad. It must be good. So then, in other words, if it wasn't good, God would not have allowed it. Since it happened, God allowed it. Therefore, it must be good. And so, what Johnson then says, or implies, every act successfully performed must be good. As he says, every action successfully performed must in the end be good, and therefore the right thing to do. Otherwise, God would not have allowed it to happen. And then he says, we could deliberately set houses ablaze to kill innocent people, and if successful, we would then know we had a duty to do it. A defense of God's goodness, which takes as its foundation duties known only after the fact, would result in a morality unworthy of the name. In other words, what Johnson is saying is that if something happens, it must be good, because if it's bad, God wouldn't have allowed it. So anything that happens is good. Then Johnson is saying, then we can set houses ablaze, we can go kill people, and if it's bad, God won't allow it to happen, so it won't actually happen. And then if our setting houses ablaze and killing people happens, it must be good, because God would not have allowed it if it wasn't good. In other words, this is a perfect example of an ad absurdum argument. That is, if the principle is that God does not allow bad things to happen because God is good, then whatever happens must be good. If that's true, then we can do whatever we want, and if it happens, it's all good. So even if we set houses ablaze and kill people and do all sorts of other terrible things, since God would not have allowed it if it was actually bad, these things must be good. The point is, they're not good. Setting houses on fire and killing people and all sorts of other bad things are bad. And so you can't argue with the principle that says anything that happens must be good, because otherwise God would not have allowed it. So the idea here is that the infant burning painfully to death, it can't just be good. We can't say, oh, well, it must be good. It became an angel with God, and therefore the baby burning to death wasn't really bad, because if it was bad, God would not have allowed it. What Johnson is trying to challenge here is this idea that whatever happens is good. No, it's not good. Real evil exists, and we must be able to explain its existence. The point being that if God is all-powerful and supremely good, then why is there evil in the world? And the evil has to be evil. It can't be just something good that happens. Because if everything that happens is good, then, well, we can do anything we want, and any evil is not really evil, it's really good. Which is an absurd idea. There's real evil in the world. We can't just write it off by saying, well, if it happens, it must be good, because God would not have allowed it. So then the theist is stuck, because the theist can't say that everything that happens is good. So how then, back to the theist, do we explain evil in the world if God is all-powerful and supremely good? If God is all-powerful, God must be able to defeat evil, and if God is supremely good, God must want to defeat evil. So why does evil happen? And then the next move that the theist makes is to say that that evil happens in the world not from God's allowing it or having anything to do with God, but evil happens in the world because human beings have free will. So it's not caused by God, it's caused by the free will that human beings have. Um, and so, when a 6 month old baby burns to death painfully in a fire, it's a product of free will that the electrician was negligent, or maybe the parents kept putting off their calling an electrician or repairing the electrical switch that was shorting out, and so they shouldn't have put it off. So they were negligent in some fashion, or maybe someone got angry and set the house on fire, and that anger is a product of free will, of some human free will. So it's not attributable. It's not attributable to God. So one of the major moves that that a theist makes when presented with evil that can't just be written off as some disguised form of good, one of the moves that a theist makes, then, given that God is all powerful and supremely good, and there's evil in the world, is to say that the evil in the world is a product of free will. What Johnson says, on the other hand, is that that won't do. So even if God, quote unquote, didn't create the fire, God, as a powerful, good bystander, should have saved the baby. So imagine, and Johnson says this on a following page in your article, where he says, I will find it. He says on page 4, as he's going to get to what I'm going to do here. So we want to say, well, it's free will, but Johnson challenges that idea of free will, that just because God didn't create the evil, God could have prevented the evil or saved the baby. I mean, imagine a bystander who had, imagine, some philosopher, very powerful philosopher, walking by a house that is on fire with an infant burning inside painfully, screaming and crying and so on. A very powerful philosopher, and you know that this philosopher is very powerful. Imagine someone walking by and with the power to save the baby, and you say to this philosopher walking by, hey, there's a baby in there burning to death. I know you have the power to save it. Won't you save it? Imagine this person walking by, this philosopher walking by, saying, well, I didn't really cause the fire. The baby's not my child. I mean, I do have the power. It's true, I could save the baby, but I didn't really cause the fire. It's not my child. I have to get somewhere else right now. It's not really my concern. I mean, imagine what you would think about that philosopher, that person who could have saved the baby but didn't. And on page 4, Johnson says, perhaps the main problem with the solutions to the problem of evil we have thus far considered is that no matter how convincing they may be in the abstract, they're implausible in certain particular cases. So instead of thinking of these as abstract qualities of a God who either is supremely evil, supremely good, or supremely powerful or not, imagine we're dealing with a particular person. They're implausible, these excuses, in certain particular cases. Picture an infant dying in a burning house, then imagine God simply observing from afar. Perhaps God is reciting excuses in his own behalf. As the child succumbs to the smoke and flames, God may be pictured as saying, sorry, but if I helped you, I would have considerable trouble deflating the ego of your parents. And don't forget, I have to keep those laws of nature consistent. And anyway, if you weren't dying in that fire, a lot of moral urgency would just go down the drain. Besides, I didn't start this fire, so you can't blame me. The point is that what might seem plausible in some abstract way to say of a being, we would never say of a particular human being. So if a person were walking by a house on fire that could save an infant burning and they didn't, we would not say of that person later on, oh, yeah, Neil, a very powerful philosopher, but, we walked by this house where there was a burning baby. I know that he could have saved this baby, but he didn't. But, Neil is a good guy. He's a good guy. You can really trust him. The answer would be no, you can't. I mean, there's no reason that you should trust me, if I'm the philosopher and I am presenting it that way. You would think that I was a terrible person. So Johnson is asking here, why would we think of any being that could prevent or save someone in trouble that didn't? Why would we think of them as good? So, okay, God didn't, start the fire or have anything to do with the fire, but certainly God could have saved the infant and didn't. And therefore, because God did not save the infant, we can't say of God that God was good. So this is a challenge. Given that God has the power, and that's one of the other points here, is that we might want to say, well, God didn't really have the power to save the child. God was willing to save the child. God is supremely good, but God didn't have the power to save the child. And Johnson's response to that is, of course, that God is, where is this? God is powerful enough to create a universe. I can't quite find it. God is powerful enough to create a universe, but God is not powerful enough to save an infant burning in a house. I mean, what sense does that make? Certainly God had the power. If God is the creator, if God is powerful enough to create the universe, God is powerful enough to save the infant. So the fact that the infant wasn't saved means that God, if powerful enough, can't be good in allowing this kind of evil. So these are several arguments in the challenge back to the theist. So the theist wants to say, well, God didn't start the fire or have anything to do with the fire. God didn't cause the evil. It was caused by human free will, human beings making bad decisions. And what Johnson is saying is not so easy to get out of that. Even if God didn't have anything to do with the fire, God could have either prevented the fire or God could have saved the baby. So I'm hoping you're seeing this kind of this sort of back and forth so far. And I think what I want to do is I want to break here. I mean, we're at 33, or it'll be 34 minutes by the time I shut up. And I want to get this video done, and then I will make another video with some following points. But I think it's best to have at least a two-part video. So this is the end of part 1 on B.C. Johnson's article, God and the Problem of Evil.